All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another MerlinCast. Today we are going to be testing out a new piece of equipment. I actually purchased a new mic, a pretty good quality one, so hopefully this will be the standard which you guys will get used to for future studio productions and whatnot. Getting into that more towards the end of the podcast, actually. But in the meantime, I figured we'd talk about some news of some things that have been coming up recently. The first little bit, Ron Glass, who played the preacher in Firefly, passed away. And he wasn't that old. I think he was like 71. I'm not sure about the specifics of the complications that led to his death, but it's very unfortunate because he did play a pretty iconic character and actually, honestly, my favorite character on the show. So it is sad to see him go by, and yet another reason to add to the possibilities of Firefly never getting a sequel, which leads me to a brief discussion about Firefly. I was discussing this earlier today. It comes up in conversation, of course. It's almost cliche at this point. Firefly is one of the greatest sci-fi shows ever, and it only got one first season, and then that movie, it got kind of screwed over completely by Fox. Guess they didn't think it would be able to find an audience or whatever. Not entirely sure what happened, but for whatever reason, didn't work out, and it always comes up as to why it didn't happen, and how if it'll ever happen again. And I remember, whenever I think about it, I always come back to a conversation that I had with my buddy Troll, and he said that he felt there just wasn't enough of an audience for it. And I want to believe that's true because I know it's kind of a cult classic, but I remember a couple years ago when we went to the Comic-Con in Philly, one of the big major events was the Firefly panel, and it was so crowded that we couldn't even get in. Like, it was packed to the walls, like to the exits. So that was just like, I don't know, 1,000 people right there at one convention. I feel like there's enough of an audience for it, but you know, it's been over a decade now, so whether or not it's going to happen, who knows. But it was a great season, and I do think the movie wrapped things up pretty well personally, but that's neither here nor there. Now, even though there are many great properties that could deserve remakes or continuations, we also live in the world where, quite frankly, everything gets a reboot now. Everything gets a sequel. You know, all the original stuff is pushed to the side. We've seen that with the movie industry, especially in my experience the last couple of years with all the movies I've seen. There's a lot of great movies out there. There's a lot of original movies out there, but they're pushed aside for bigger franchises, which mean, you know, brand association, more money. I get it, but it's unfortunate. In that vein, though, Highlander might be getting a reboot, which I find interesting because I think that rebooting Highlander in a modern sense would be kind of cool. Like, I would like to get more Highlander products. I would like to get more Highlander stories. But very quickly, I think two things. The original film is a classic, but it's kind of a campy, awesome 80s classic. It's sort of difficult to recreate that kind of magic, which is a mistake with a lot of films like that. I mean, you had RoboCop and Total Recall. I believe some films shouldn't be touched. Could Highlander theoretically be made better? Sure, but Highlander, of course, has that really troubled history of every time they tried to make a sequel based on it, it was never as good as the original film. In fact, a lot of times it was terrible. Now, I know some people like the show, and don't get me wrong, the show is not bad, but I don't think it's particularly excellent either, and it's probably the best thing to come from the original movie. Every other film and a lot of I think there was an animated sequel and there was a video game, like there were other elements based on it, but most of them are pretty bad. The franchise did not leave on a very good note with Highlander The Source, which is terrible. You can check out the Spoonie review. It was on the Sci-Fi Channel years ago, and really that's the last major Highlander thing we had. I think that Highlander has potential, but you should tread very carefully with it because it does not have a good history of producing good content for sequels based on it. Moving on to some anime-related news, because, of course, you know, with the anime-centric nature of my channel, why not? Turns out that Gintama is getting the anime continuation returning January, so I've heard from some people that Gintama is not quite as awesome as it was, but regardless, if you're a fan, there's more content coming out January. I haven't been watching the Gintama story arcs for a while. That was something that I was doing, and those videos were fairly popular. I might go back to doing them, I don't know. But the thing is, there was this one arc that was really hyped up, and I just thought it was, like, okay, and ever since then, I never really went back. I'm like, all right, well, you know, if this is considered one of the great ones, you know, hundreds of episodes later, who knows. But anyway, there's more Gintama, so it's going strong. There's enough of a fan base there, that's good. Interestingly enough, the One Piece Gold movie broke some records in China. Apparently broke the biggest record for raking in money over a period of 3 days. And the China market has been opening up a lot in general for films, and I guess that includes anime. And it turns out One Piece is popular over there, as it is just about everywhere else. So that certainly makes sense. On that note, it was interesting, but apparently in the Oscars this year, in the short animated film category, there are no anime films listed as being contenders. Now, I find that kind of outrageous because really Japan is sort of the haven for animation. That's what they do. I find it hard to believe there was nothing they produced over the past year that's worthy of a submission. So that's a little odd, but just a tidbit there. I have my issues with the Oscars anyway, but just a little hint there as well. Now, moving into more of a general anime discussion. Over Thanksgiving, I'm actually still enjoying some of the food as we speak. My sister and I got together and we decided to watch some anime because it's just something we hadn't done in a long time. And I'd picked out the Escaflowne movie because it was a gift she gave me years ago and I never watched it. So I was like, you know what, might as well do it now. Now, for those of you that don't know, Escaflowne is kind of this classic series. It's sort of a medieval fantasy about the classic girl gets transported to another world. Turns out she's like a chosen one. She's got the powers to see the future, and she runs into this young boy who's the prince of, kind of like one of the last of his people, this ancient race of people, and they're warring with this evil empire, and there is this one weapon that could change the balance of everything, and it's this giant suit of armor, which is basically a mech. So it's a fantasy mech series, and it's powered by the blood of a dragon, and only the dragon slayer can do it, and they're going after her because she has some connection to everything going on, and it's just this really, really cool, really epic, beautifully drawn fantasy anime. It's actually one of my favorites. I really love the show, which is why I thought going back to watch the movie again, it would be a pretty fun experience. Now, I have to say, the Escaflowne movie, when it finished, I was like, that movie has some problems. Now, I will say this. It is beautifully animated. It really is. And it has the great Escaflowne soundtrack that keeps everything epic. But they alter the characters, because it kind of brings me to the general discussion with this, is that anime movies, particularly anime movies based on series, and I guess adaptations of any, series to a film, probably have this issue, of course, but you're trying to fit like a 26 episode anime into a movie that's a little over an hour long and try to complete the whole story. You're going to have some issues, and man, like, they really switched some things around. Like, they removed one whole villain completely, and they changed like certain things about certain characters. They jumped forward with their character arcs. Like, Vaughn is like this brash, egotistical, hot-headed warrior, which he kind of is in the show, but you see a lot more of his character. You get to know a little more about him. He becomes more of a badass throughout the series, but he starts off in the opening of the anime just on the skyship, just murdering people, and I'm like, he was never that badass of the show, not until like the very end. And they switched some things around with his brother, Falcon, making him the main villain of the movie, which kind of worked, but he's like, he hates his brother, and we don't really know why. And Hitomi, the main character, is much more depressed, and there's sort of this weird, like, connection with her and the villain that's never explained, and she wasn't that depressed in the show. And there's the swashbuckling swordsman, Alan, has like no character, and there's like, there's this thing, and it does that, and this is why we need this, and they'll just jump from plot point to plot point without explaining anything. So, in all fairness, it does kind of cover the whole plot of the show, but basically without explaining anything, and I was amazed by that. And I have to say, it has like one of the most anticlimactic endings to any movie I've ever seen, because there is this lion guy, because there's like beast men, different races of beast men in this world naturally, and there's this lion guy who he's actually like a good guy in the show, if I remember correctly, but he's working with the evil Imperial guys, even though he apparently doesn't want to, and he switches his allegiance like midway through. And spoilers for the movie, but I have to say this, like right before Vaughn is about to battle Lord Falcon, instead of having like this big epic battle, the lion guy's like, "You will suffer for everything you've ever done," Falcon, and he stabs him like right through the heart. And I'm like, on one hand, that's kind of awesome, because this lion guy is the most interesting character in the movie. He's just this solemn, reflective, philosophical lion man. It looks like Leomon from Digimon. And he just kills the bad guy in the most unceremonial way. And I'm like, I feel a little cheated because I didn't get this big ass battle, but it was kind of awesome. So the movie, I don't want to say it's a good intro to the show, because if you watch this movie, you're just going to be confused, and you might want to check out the show, but you might be like, okay, is this really worth checking out? And on the other hand, I think this is an example of a type of film that I think it's better enjoyed if you've seen the show, you want to see a slightly different interpretation. It's beautiful to look at, and it has some awesome action, music, but the show had that too, and it also had time to flesh out the characters and the world, which is what makes it a great series. And that's just a problem I find is very common with a lot of anime films that are based on a series. I prefer the ones that take place within the context of the series at some point chronologically, or one of the random alternate dimension spin-offs like the 1000 DBZ movies, for instance, but ones that condense everything just never work out, it seems. That leads me to another little piece of information I'd like to discuss. Now, this is kind of going a little further away from anime, but I just found it interesting that I have to celebrate this, and I might continue to do more videos on it. For Spider-Man Homecoming, we must celebrate, and I will celebrate, that my favorite Spider-Man villain, one of my favorite comic book villains of all time, the Vulture, is going to be the main villain of a Spider-Man movie. And this is something that it's interesting when you kind of look through the little details. You can see the beginnings of this becoming an eventuality. Because I remember back in 2007, after Spider-Man 3, when they were considering doing Spider-Man 4, Vulture, there was a script for Vulture being the main villain in that movie too. But that got scrapped. There was a reboot. They decided to do some other things. That was fine. But once again, with the Sinister Six, with the Amazing Spider-Man films, you kind of saw the Vulture wings. You saw that there was going to be Vulture in the movie. And I'm just like, I just want to see Vulture. I want to see the Sinister Six, ultimately. But the Vulture I'd be happy with. Didn't happen, of course. They had to reboot it again. And finally, it looks like somebody out there is a fan of the Vulture, and they're like, we think he's a good villain. Let's use him for the movie. And this is something that I have been talking about on my channel pretty much since the beginning. Not constantly, but I have mentioned it several times. And I've always kind of been pushing for this. And I remember one of my earliest videos on YouTube, I talked about the Vulture. I really like the villain. And some people, whenever I tell people that I really like him, people don't understand that. They don't, it's just not an obvious choice. People don't really, bash me for it. Oh, you like the Vulture, it's terrible. No, people don't go that far, but he does seem like a less obvious choice. Because whenever you do a top list of Spider-Man's most dangerous villains or his biggest villains, Vulture rarely comes up. And he is kind of an old school villain. He's kind of silly looking. But I think that he's just a villain that's a little underappreciated. For one thing, he's one of Spider-Man's oldest villains. And I don't mean just in age. He's the second villain he ever fought. The first supervillain, technically, in a costume. And like any other villain with their first encounter, he almost killed him. He's been in just about every incarnation of the Sinister Six. He's kind of ranked up there, fighting alongside a lot of the main villains. He's a dangerous guy, and in terms of his intellect and his cruelty, he's up there with Dr. Octopus. He's just a much more petty guy, I guess you could say. And yeah, he's not the most dangerous villain, but I've always found the Vulture very impressive because he's persistent. He's a persistent threat, and he's essentially just an elderly gentleman with a big chip on his shoulder who dresses up in a bird outfit, goes around committing crimes, and is able to go toe-to-toe with Spider-Man. Basically, the greatest hero in Marvel. Let's be honest. He's essentially Marvel's Batman. That's impressive. He might not necessarily be A-list material, but I think he is. I think he really is. He's especially had a lot more to do in recent years. He's kind of become more of a behind-the-scenes master tactician sort of guy, but there's just something about the vengeful nature of the guy that I've always liked. I don't know. He's just a very fascinating character to me. He's kind of that perfect blend of he's really scary, but he's also really silly. And I think that's an interesting type of balance that not a lot of characters can pull off. Either way, though, Michael Keaton, Birdman himself, is going to be playing the Vulture, so I'm going to be happy with that. I guess I'll end this little podcast with a couple little announcements. This year has kind of been a year of creativity for me. I did my first film earlier, which you can check out on the channel. It's quite a raw piece of material, but it was fun to make, and it's up there. And I also produced some music for the first time. There's an album you can listen to, Cyborg Daydream. I'm a little more proud of that. And I'm also, upon completing my first novel, I'm getting done with the first draft now, and I'm going to go through it, and I'm not sure how I'm going to release it, but I will be promoting it soon. It's going to be The Adventures of Mr. Omega. It's a superhero story, so be looking forward to that soon, guys. And in a more general note, I'm actually going to be really pushing forward to trying to kind of reinvent this channel a little bit and really push myself, because I'll be honest, for a number of different reasons. I think I've become kind of unfocused, and I tried a couple different things, and I think having to put some of my videos on the site and keep them off YouTube has hurt me a little bit, and I think that just, job stuff and other personal stuff has made the last couple of years very uneven in terms of content. But I want to get back to producing the videos that you guys like the most, but also really upping my game, trying some new things, and actually getting some of my friends in and creating some sort of a staff for this, where I'm going to get on a schedule, and I'm going to be upping some equipment. I've actually produced this microphone along with some other things, so the next year, I'm going to really be trying to go full force into this and make Merlin the Mighty something really awesome for you guys to enjoy. So I appreciate the support and look forward to some new things, and I hope this was a fun little podcast for you. Let me know how it sounds. All right, everybody, stay magical.